This series invites scholars to demonstrate how the humanities and civic discourse enrich our understanding of American government. Hosted on the campus of Jacksonville State University, these free events are open to the public. This series welcomes the campus, community, and country to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by generous grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Jack Miller Center. The National Endowment for the Humanities serves and strengthens our nation by supporting high-quality projects and programs in the humanities and by making the humanities available to all Americans. Its grants support the building blocks of American civil society, examining the human condition, promoting civics education, understanding our cultural heritage, fostering mutual respect for diverse beliefs and cultures, and developing media and information literacy. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its politics, and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. Before I get into a quick introduction on today's event, I do want to remind our students who are attending in person and online that we have partnered up with our general education program, Jack's Mix. This is part of the ethical leadership track. And so if you are here to earn part of your general education, just stick around. At the end of the event, you can scan a QR code, both either online or in person, to help advance your progress to earning one of these free micro-credentials. We also have sign-in sheets for those that are here in person who would want to stay connected with us for future events. Before I introduce our lecturers here to join us for Civic Discourse and to provide us some context of their point prior to that, I want to give you a quick introduction to two important international institutions that often come up when we talk about global justice: the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, and the International Criminal Court, or ICC. Let's start with the International Court of Justice. The ICJ is sometimes called the World Court. It's the main judicial body of the United Nations, and its job is to settle legal disputes between states, or as we commonly talked about them in the United States, countries. The key is only a state, right, only a country, not individuals or organizations, can appear before this institution. So the 193 members of the United Nations are the only ones that can bring cases to this court. The ICJ has 15 judges, each serving 9-year terms. Every 3 years, 5 of those judges are replaced, so the court keeps a steady rotation and balance of experience. These judges come from all around the world, representing different legal traditions and systems. The International Criminal Court, or the ICC, is different. While the ICJ deals with disputes between states, the ICC prosecutes individuals for the world's most serious crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. The idea for such a court didn't appear simply overnight. It began after World War II with the Nuremberg trials, when the world faced the question of how to hold the Nazi leaders accountable for the atrocities that, at that time, weren't even clearly legally defined under existing laws. Out of that came the concept of the crime against humanity, an act so inhumane and widespread that it violated the consciousness of the world. Right after that, there was a second set of trials in Asia, commonly referred to as the Tokyo trials, which prosecuted leaders of Imperial Japan for similar crimes. These two efforts were the first time in history that individuals, not governments, were held criminally responsible under international law instead of being met with simply force or might as the end of a war. After those trials, the United Nations recognized the need for a permanent international court, but the Cold War kept these ideas frozen for decades. It wasn't until the late 1980s, thanks to a proposal from Trinidad and Tobago, that the conversation restarted. Then, as wars broke out in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and elsewhere, the world saw again the urgent need for a permanent tribunal. In 1998, nations gathered in Rome and adopted what was called the Rome Statute, which officially created the International Criminal Court. The ICC came into force in 2002 and has been with us, therefore, for less than just a generation, or about, at this point, a generation. So today we have these two institutions, the ICJ, which handles disputes between states, and the ICC, which holds individuals responsible for the greatest crimes against humanity. These are some institutions you will probably hear more about here from our guest speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce them to you. Dr. Nancy Conbs graduated first in her class from the University of California at Berkeley School of Law. She has written extensively on topics in international law and international criminal justice, publishing 2 books and dozens of articles and essays. Professor Conbs has appeared as an expert witness in international criminal trials in Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands, and she was a member of the International Expert Framework on the International Criminal Procedure. Before attending university, Professor Conbs owned and operated a chimney sweeping business. Dr. J.D. Bowers is the Dean of Honors College at Rutgers University and a professor of practice and history. His research and teaching focuses on genocide, human rights, and Black studies. Nationally, he was a founder and former executive director of the Council on Honors Education, an organization of over 130 land-grant public university honors colleges or programs that has served to set standards for high-impact, enriched collegiate education and research. He's also an avid sailor, surfer, and water sports enthusiast, loves the backpack and hike and camp, and is a proud fan of Indiana football. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Conbs to the stage.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. This is my first time in Alabama, and I have been having a marvelous time. You guys know how to do hospitality, so thank you very, very much. I'm here to talk about criminal justice after mass atrocities. So my focus will be more on the ICC end of the equation than the ICJ. As we're going to see through the next hour or so, these are really hard questions, and there are no clear answers. Nobody's gonna win because there's pros and cons to all of the issues that we describe. But let's go back to the beginning. I'm on the side in favor of criminal justice after mass atrocities. This thing thinks I'm taller than I am. Maybe I'll just stay at this height. Microphone 1, Nancy 0. All right, let's go back to the beginning and think about mass atrocities. These have occurred throughout human history, right? This is not, you pick up the newspaper, you look at your phone, and there are horrible things going on in the world today, but there have been horrible things going on since time began, right? And the old way of dealing with it was basically formed on vengeance, right? The group that won imposed summary justice, usually some form of execution, on the group that lost. And the cycle of vengeance continued because the losers did not forget what had happened to them. So if you fast forward to World War I, the Allies thought it would be a great idea to have a tribunal that imposed criminal justice, particularly on those who committed war crimes, and particularly those in Germany who committed war crimes. And so they put this actually in the Treaty of Versailles, that this was going to happen, and they issued indictments against approximately 1,000 Germans. And Germany said, oh, nope, I'm sorry, we just cannot send these people to you. We are sufficiently unstable. The population would revolt. Let us do it ourselves. We'll sort this, okay? And the international community, the Allies, did not want Germany to implode. It was a credible allegation. And so they said, okay, Germany, here's our 1,000 indictments. You go ahead and try them yourselves. And you want to know how many they tried? 12. You know how many they convicted? 6. And the longest sentence was 4 years. So it didn't seem like such a credible effort after all. And if you fast forward to World War II, as Professor Gross was telling us, the modern international criminal justice movement developed out of World War II. Why? You start with the fact that 70 to 80 million people died during World War II. I mean, stop for a second and try to get your head around 70 or 80 million people, men, women, and children. It's almost inconceivable. And so the sense was, we've got to do something different. This is human civilization cannot continue doing these sorts of things. And so the Allies at that point decided, okay, we're not sending it back to Germany. We learned our lesson from World War I. We are going to establish international criminal tribunals, and we are going to prosecute high-level Japanese, high-level German offenders, and they set up a bunch of occupation tribunals to prosecute lower-level, particularly German offenders, so about 5,000 of them in total. Now, that at that time, that was a very marked step forward, right? And as I talked about earlier today in a history class, it was pretty much all at the hands of the Americans. The United States was integral in coming up with this plan, drafting the statute for the International Tribunal, and believing that justice was better than summary vengeance, okay? Now, was it perfect? No, it wasn't perfect. It was called victor's justice. Why? Because only the Germans could be prosecuted at the Nuremberg Tribunal. The Americans couldn't, the French couldn't, and don't kid yourself, every side committed some war crimes, but only the Germans and then the Japanese and the Tokyo Tribunal. So this was considered quite a blemish in one sense, and we might talk at some point about what do we call justice. And I would concede that justice typically requires that everybody be subject to the same legal standards and prohibitions. At the same time, it was impossible to think that the Allies, after what they had been through and what they considered the rightness of their cause, would both subject the Germans to a fair trial and, in other words, not summarily execute them, and also subject themselves to criminal justice by, international authorities. So that's where it stood for about 50 years. And during the Cold War, there was no international criminal justice because the USSR and the United States couldn't agree on, whether the sky was blue, let alone anything else. And so international criminal justice went into desuetude. Since then, as Professor Gross told you, starting from the 1990s, international criminal tribunals have developed, first starting with a number of discrete locations and looking backwards. So in the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, in East Timor, in Kosovo, these are bodies that are established specifically to impose criminal accountability on people who committed crimes in discrete past conflicts. Okay. And now we also have, as Professor Gross told you, the International Criminal Court, which is quite different because it is not looking backwards at that crime that happened 2 years ago. It's prospective, right? It's like any court. I mean, think about the court system in Alabama. It's a prospective court. It's just sitting there waiting for you to do something bad. And when you do, you can be indicted and the court is sitting there and ready to take your case, right? That's and that's what the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is doing. Now, it has very specific jurisdictional requirements, so not everybody, and whether states ratify the treaty makes a difference to whether their nationals can be brought before it. But in any event, what I want to leave you with is it has now become the expected response that when a mass atrocity occurs, and we are talking about very serious crimes like genocide, like crimes against humanity, like serious war crimes, that there will be a criminal response to that in some form. It's still by no means perfect, and I expect Dr. Bowers to tell us all about its flaws, to which I will agree because I'm no idealist. I mean, there's a lot of things that aren't going right. But I would say, as a law professor, there's a lot of things not going right in American criminal law, in French criminal, it's not as though everything is perfect when you are talking about imposing criminal accountability on individuals. But I will say that for international criminal justice, I do think that we have been on a positive trajectory. There has been more of it, more consistent and more justified international criminal justice over the 25 years or so, the generation that Dr. Gross referred to. So why might we, despite certain flaws, which we'll spend some time talking about, why might we want to stay on this path? Why might we think that this is actually a good idea? One is going back to World War II. It is the civilized thing to do, particularly because when victims have been the subject of mass atrocities, they're not going to just forget about it. Something is going to happen. And so your array of options will include violent reprisals. And so against people who may be guilty, but may not be guilty. And that's what a trial is there to ascertain. In fact, in all of these international tribunals, plenty of defendants are acquitted. They are not kangaroo courts. The ICC is often argued to be too pro-defendant, too rigorous in its standards of proof. If we had time, I could go through some of the cases and show you. I mean, a lot of people have been acquitted. Okay, so that just seems fair particularly when you're talking about the most serious crimes known to humankind. Secondly, if you ask victims what they want criminal justice. I mean, certainly victims like reparations, victims like acknowledgement, truth commissions are very beneficial and valuable to some victims, but they also want criminal accountability, because that's just what you would come to expect after crimes like this. Another reason to be very positive is that these trials have really improved over the course of the 25 years. You would think when you're talking about, say, the Rwandan genocide, where approximately 800,000 people were killed in about 3 months, you would think, well, gosh, that ought to be some easy trial to hold. Again, I mean, 800,000 people, surely you can find evidence. Turns out it's actually kind of hard to get evidence, particularly in some locations and at some periods of time. But things have improved dramatically. The procedures have improved. The amounts of evidence that we now get from digital sources like satellite imagery, like video, victims now in a mass atrocity, if you look at YouTube, it is believed that there are more videotapes of Syrian atrocities during the Syrian civil war than there were minutes in the Syrian civil war. That's how many people are videotaping the awful things that are happening to them and uploading them to YouTube. So our ability to carry out criminal justice in a legitimate and accurate way has really improved, particularly in the last 10 years or so. In some sense, the charges against international criminal justice show that it's a victim of its own success, not its failure. International criminal justice is contested, particularly in the United States, largely because the ICC and other tribunals are not content to be tribunals of victor's justice anymore. They are striving to impose universal rules for everyone, rich or poor, powerful or weak, the idea being that we all should comply with the same legal standards. That has upset some of the more powerful nations. And that's why you're getting a lot of pushback. But then in some sense, that's a feature, not a bug. We don't really want an international criminal justice system where only the weak losers get prosecuted. Couple more points, and then I'm going to cede the floor to Dr. Bowers. One is that there is credible empirical evidence that the ICC and other forms of international criminal justice are meeting its goals, particularly deterrence. Right? The idea here is that maybe if leaders of either countries or rebel groups are planning on engaging in mass atrocities, if they think, well, I may end up, even if I succeed, I may end up in a courtroom in The Hague and for the rest of my life in jail, that might get them to think twice. And there is credible evidence that the ICC is having a deterrent effect. It's a little bit counterintuitive to me, frankly, because I would have thought before I read this scholarship that that the goals would have to be more expressive rather than deterrent, because frankly, I think people, particularly rebel leaders and that who engage in activities like this, have much more likelihood of ending up with a bullet in them than behind a jailhouse door. But apparently I was wrong. There is a deterrent effect. Two last things. One is that, as I say, when we talk together, I will concede the many, many flaws in international criminal justice. This is by no means a perfect system. But I ask you, what's the alternative? And if the alternative is to do nothing, if the alternative is to say, oh, you committed a genocide, well, that's really, that wasn't very nice, and to move on, then that's not a viable alternative at all. So that we should be at least trying to have a system of justice that we are working at and improving and committed to, even if we realize that this could be a multi-generational effort to make it something that we would effectively be proud of. And finally, I'll end with, I remember when I first got into this field, I read this little adage that has always stayed with me, and I think it kind of encapsulates why we should actually be still on this path. And the adage is, if you kill one person, you go to jail. If you kill 20 people, you get sent to an insane asylum. If you kill 20,000 people, you get invited to a peace conference. And that is largely true and not right. It should not be the case that by virtue of the magnitude of your crimes, that they are so massive and so egregious that criminal justice has nothing to say to you. If you asked anybody in this room, anybody in the state of Alabama, should somebody who murders another human being go to jail, I don't think there'd be a single person who would say no. And yet, we resist that notion when the number of individuals is in 5 figures and the events take place far from here. That doesn't seem right to me. And so that's why I think we should continue striving toward criminal accountability after mass atrocities. Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Ben, thank you for hosting us to Jacksonville State University. Thank you for hosting us into the NEH. Thank you for the ongoing efforts to spread the humanities far and wide. It's not with a conviction or any alignment with my past or present beliefs, activities, and scholarships that I stand here today to reject or at least significantly question the wisdom and focus on post-genocide justice. In some point of fact, I think I just lost the coin toss, and Nancy said, yeah, I'll take the affirmative. And I said, sure, I will put myself in the position of taking the negative. But it is with, I think, a wiseness and a wise action for us to see the limits of post-atrocity justice efforts and its inabilities to affect the common vision of its past and present, as well as then deeply question any future convictions towards its centrality in global responses to atrocities. My quick take is this. First, I think justice is conditional and reality-based. It is not philosophical and unconditional and not based necessarily in the pursuit of what is right and what's wrong, but rather it's based in pursuit of what is realpolitik. Since justice is not universal, power politics continues to define the process. And I would argue actually the opposite of what Nancy has argued, that it has not evolved since 1945. In fact, Justice Powell, P-A-L, questioned its very foundations and the premises of the Tokyo tribunals throughout that entire process, leading us to levels of concern for what was happening then and what continues to happen now. different levels and different forces of justice are often required in order to address atrocity, so that we end up in contradictory relationships and a multitude of efforts and designs in order to even get at something that appears to be international post-conflict justice. And finally, in that element, nations are always free to opt out. And in a system that you want to claim, if it is right and just, then it is not right and just to have a process that allows a nation to simply not sign on to those treaties, not be a partner in them, or to abrogate the most significant terms and elements of those treaties. I would also go further and say that though the scholarship does seem to show some minor deterrent impact, I think reality shows very differently. We are not hurting for present day examples of people, mostly men, who have gone on to further their aims of atrocities and goals of conquest and colonialization and outright elimination of other nations in this day and age, so that we could say they have been deterred. Those who have standing indictments are, point in fact, an example of that. I do think that justice is only ever going to be partial and incomplete. Now, one could argue that having something partial and incomplete doesn't mean that we should do away with it. And there is some merit to that kind of argument. But it is something that strives so heavily for this philosophical completeness and this philosophical and practical transformation at the end that I think international justice as a concept undermines itself. Then there is the fact that places without justice have not fared any better or fared any worse than places with justice. And here I contrast my two in situ examples of Bosnia and Cyprus. I don't think that either place is any better than the other. Both have these internal areas within the nation that are under control of pseudo governments that have taken full control of at least the territory, impose their own rules, bring in their own immigrants, bring in their own people, and remake a portion of a physical portion of the society, and then a social portion of the society in their own image. Those two, one without any trials and tribunals, one where the killers continue to exist and live and rule and govern in Cyprus, is no different than the trials that have gone on in Bosnia, where many of the perpetrators continue to live and exist and keep going, and now, of course, have reversed their acceptance of the conviction of genocide at Srebrenica, where the mayor of Srebrenica is a Serb who has said, no genocide took place here. We will take down the monuments. We will take down the focus on this. We will rebuild, and we will rebuild because we are in the Republic of Srpska. Finally, I think that justice may not make sense in our future world as we move ahead. And this was where I've been spending a lot of my time on recent research, with a growing understanding of the psychosocial elements of perpetration and obedience. There are many scientific scholars who are returning to the experiments of Milgram, and though they do not reenact the Milgram experiment because of the ethics of that, they are finding that obedience is far more complex, and perpetration through obedience is a far more complicated and nuanced action than what we just assumed to be the original Goldhagen Browning premise of following orders and not following orders. And so if we move into that realm where it is truly then a psychosocial element of obedience, we have a factor where it doesn't matter if we pursue justice against the leaders, we would actually have to be looking more at the followers. And we would have to be looking at those that did the perpetration acts rather than the perpetration definitions. And international justice so far, with the exception of Rwanda, with the real true exception of Rwanda, where they went from having the International Tribunal in Arusha, plus then the appeals court in Den Haag, and then they had the Rwandan national trials, and then they had the courts on the grass, the Gacaca, the local trials. That was the only example that I can think of where a complete set of tribunals was enacted to try to get at as many as 80,000 perpetrators. That has been the only issue. Even then, after 10 years and a decade, they had to declare the procedural elements of justice over due to budgetary constraints, societal pressures, exhaustion, quite frankly, and simply at the end declared anyone who was still in jail on an indictment to have been guilty, time served, please go live out your life. So in that sense, I think international justice has proven that it can't really accomplish the goals, the lofty goals that we set out for it. Now, Raphael Lemkin, the inventor of the word of genocide, the creator of the word genocide, saw genocide as a crime of the state, appropriately adjudicated by the International Criminal, by the ICJ, International Court of Justice. And while we are in an age where states want, one, individuals tried for their specific crimes, which means they want individuals adjudicated by international and national hybrid trials or even national courts, we are actually defining it in a way today that perpetrators, as Nancy said repeatedly, never define themselves as being inclusive in that framework of justice. So to the victor go the spoils, to the victors go the definition of international justice. And if you aren't willing and able to define philosophical principles that will apply to everyone equally, and I understand the ICC wants to move in that direction, but in reality, the nations, none of the nations that have not signed on to the ICC are eager to do so again today. And if we look at the list, we will see that there are some of the worst perpetrating nations that there can be. So, and to explain then that second of the point, where defined perpetrators rarely include themselves in the justice, in the wake of the atrocities where the parameters of justice are defined, they are rarely truly set out in philosophical terms, and far more in practical terms to fit the situation, and are therefore, as Justice Powell in Tokyo stated, preordained in terms of the outcome of these tribunals. I think that international justice has become, quite frankly, an impossible objective. The global actors who seek international justice are just as divided as the nation states are internally in their outlooks. They do not understand or know or have a firm grasp on whether retributive justice is a good model. States and peoples seek retributive justice, and the terms of the tribunal often exclude equal and fair consideration by adopting, however, a specific victimization narrative that does not square with the messy truth of the conflicts that surround genocide, which are often conflicts of war. Furthermore, the lack of a universal jurisdiction, meaning that only select prosecutions will take place, continues the premise that many nations will refuse to add the convention to their own laws. The spectrum of prosecutions from Nuremberg to Rwanda leaves us bewildered with who we actually hold responsible and whether we can truly punish all of the perpetrators or only the active perpetrators. And I would ask, and perhaps this is an unfair point in some regards, but because you can't always prove a negative, right? I'm trying to start reading up on, can you prove a negative? And there's some evidence that you can and cannot and how far to go. But when has it been a deterrent? Obviously, Vladimir Putin didn't sit anywhere in his office, in his homes, wherever, and say, gosh, if I renew my crimes or renew my conflict against Ukraine, I might find myself with an indictment before the ICC and I might be punished. And so I'm not going to do that. So we do have at least one case where we know it wasn't a deterrent. We have other cases we could argue that it was not a deterrent. It has not been a deterrent. I'd like to actually see a case that could be proven through that process to say, no, I hold back because of the International Criminal Court or because I will be brought to justice. Then finally, I think you have to get into the facts of international justice on behalf of the victims. Without the death penalty on an international level, can there ever be equitable justice? You look at, you watch the news, I watch the news, and I'm often fascinated by the stories I see in the wake of a murder, an individual murder that may happen in many cities across this country. Whether the family of the victims say, I forgive, you do hear that. There are family members who say that. There are like, this is a tragedy. It's obviously going to change our lives, but in the wake of this, I have to forgive the perpetrator. Or you hear the family say, bring that person to justice, and I hope justice is swift and vicious and complete. And so there is no definition of justice that suits the victims who remain alive, those who are victimized when the victim is killed. And so we don't know what equitable justice could be for all, especially when we are going to the level of those 3 million other Rwandans who were left behind, right? What did they want? There is not a collective answer to that. There's not a universal understanding. And so what do they get from this international justice, especially in times when, the Rwandan International Tribunal was held in Arusha. It wasn't even held in Rwanda. So it was held distant for a lot of excellent reasons, but it was held distant from the lives of those who had experienced the atrocities. And do they get what they really need? When something goes on like a mass atrocity, what is needed is not necessarily a conviction before a court. What is needed is restitution and recovery programs, restorative justice, education, safety, psychological counseling and services. Even in the ICC, however, where the victims play a role in the judicial proceedings, there has been no real actualized remedy. So, with that, I want to be conscious of our time and move into our next stage. But I think that prosecuting genocide today has become more about the historical record than actually seeking justice. And I am actually content in arguing that we should leave it to the historians to establish the guilt, the innocence, the complexity, and not necessarily spend our time seeking to prosecute 12, 20, 15, however many we prosecute. When the real answer is, it's not about prosecuting the perpetrators, it's about protecting the peoples in the wake of the atrocity. Thank you.
Thank you all for that. That's it's a lot to think about, and maybe a good starting point, although a lofty starting point would be for us to think more deeply about the ideas of justice that you presented to us. We've had this idea of criminal justice, we've had this idea of restorative justice. Could you maybe each explain a bit more of how you understand justice and maybe how these understandings lead to different conclusions? No.
This on? Yep. Well, it's a great question because I was thinking as Dr. Bowers was talking that I agree with so much of what he said, and particularly the last bit about what victims need, because there is no question in my mind that throwing a perpetrator in jail is not the sum total of what victims need. They do need money, counseling, trauma, treatment, etc. So I see justice and truth and to know what happened. So I see justice as capacious. It involves all of that, but it also involves, to my mind, criminal sanctions on those who violate the worst prohibitions known to humankind.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. I actually was just arguing that very point with my students. I think the main thing that justice does bring us today is truth. And I think that it brings us that sense of the victim's ability to say we were right, or perhaps even we were wronged in this, and that the world will long remember that we were wronged in this. And I made my point to my own students, which is your point, which is I said the best thing about the international tribunals that I've attended and worked with is basically that they establish it with a legal framework that historians aren't. I think we got into this in the class earlier this morning. The historians aren't bound by. Though the historians will do the better research because we'll do all the research and we'll look into all the corners. And the legal field will only look into the parameters of the legalities, or that's what can be presented, I should say. then I think together you get a far more expansive, comprehensive sense of justice. But in the end, you know, I think one of the critiques of the ICC has long been, and perhaps I still agree with this one critique, it's very expensive. And whether or not we like expenses entering into it, I'm a dean, expenses enter into everything. But it's very expensive, and in many ways that money is probably, in a social contract sense, best spent on victims themselves to give them all these other things. If I had to pick, I want the health of the victims in the outcome.
Yeah, so Dr. Bowers hit me where it hurt, because I agree, and I'm highly sensitive to how expensive it is. I think if you looked at the money spent today on, say, an ICC trial, and you'd ask yourself, is that the highest and best use of these dollars? I think the answer has to be no. So the only way it becomes the highest and best use is if you are advancing towards something better, if you are having an impact on the future. It's not just about what this set of victims would prefer or benefit from. It is creating a world in which there are fewer victims altogether. And that's where it's very difficult. I appreciate what Dr. Bowers said about deterrence, that you can't prove, well, let me tell you about the studies very briefly, but think about if we're going to talk about Vladimir Putin, I'm going to talk about the guy who's carjacking somebody in Anniston, because somebody is right now, and we have laws on the books, and I don't think we would say, well, then the criminal justice system of Alabama doesn't work, let's just get rid of it all because people still keep committing crimes. We have to hope that at the margins, deterrence does work, right? Because we know that whether on the global stage or in Alabama or anywhere else, there are going to be crimes committed no matter what sanctions are imposed. The studies that purport to find, and I'm not a social scientist, so I can't evaluate their methods, but what they've done is they have compared situations that the ICC has opened a preliminary examination in, and these are the first stages where the ICC is just looking over you and saying, country, we're watching, versus very similar places and conflicts that the ICC is not having a preliminary investigation in. And what they found was a reduction in the violence in the places where the ICC was watching. So is that the be all and end all? No, I don't know of any studies that can prove whether, I did not go, I was giving them an example. I did not today, and this is the God's honest truth, I did not kill my mother-in-law. I didn't. And I won't say it was because the laws of Alabama prohibit that, right? The reasons that we do or don't do things are highly multifaceted, but I do think the criminal prohibitions have certainly a marginal deterrent effect on most of us, including high-level offenders.
Yeah, I think I can grant that. But I probably would, in the end, say that I think international justice does have a mild deterrent of impact. But I'm going to say that it depends upon the nations and it depends upon the players. And so we all know that the world isn't ordered equally. And the Security Council alone shows us the world isn't ordered equally. So it does not play the same. It is not going to deter leaders of these global powers from doing what they want to do. I think that's obvious. International law be damned. Because all you have to do to make it legal is to strike that term of international law from your domestic law, or abrogate a term, or unsign a document, or these are steps that all can be taken in a matter of days. And so it's not an equal field. Is the president of Barbados deterred? Yeah, maybe somewhat, right? And there are leaders out there who are more moral and who take up the R2P argument, the responsibility to protect. And I do appreciate the work that Madeline Albright and others did in that course of espousing that and getting that out there. But I think two rational people would have to sit down over dollar margaritas and argue what is the case study where there was somebody big slowed it down. and brought it to a halt, or somebody with a lot to lose brought it to a halt. And then I do keep coming back to this, how I study Bosnia very closely, and I'm still studying Cyprus very closely, and we'll return to the island in 2 weeks. And I keep coming back to, the lack of a tribunal or any kind of justice in the wake of the Cyprus conflict, which still technically is there, right? Cyprus is still divided. The Turks are still occupying the north with 40,000 troops. The Greeks are still there, despite Cyprus being an independent republic of its own in the European Union. So, how have they healed? How have they changed? And they have. There's still a border. I still have to cross. I still have to check in. I still have to do, transition from phone plan to phone plan when I cross that line. They still don't like each other. There's still troops with weapons pointed at each other. And the same thing happens in Bosnia. When you cross the border from the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina and you go into the quote-unquote Republic of Srpska, there are different police people, right? There are different police officers carrying different weapons. They've renamed the roads, they've renamed the towns again, and they're not happy to have people crossing into their territory who don't agree with them. And they will, during a peace march of all things, every year, stand there with their guns and flip their safeties on and off. So Bosnia is no different than Cyprus, though Bosnia has supposedly had years of tribunals and brought the worst of the perpetrators to justice. But then we saw in one case, of course, Bosnia is also where one of the convicted perpetrators committed suicide right before the courts. That's how unrepentant people can still be. And sometimes that pursuit of justice reinforces that unrepentance.
One of the goals of this series is help students or campus or community better understand American government. What can we as Americans take away from this? Why we as Americans should we be concerned about how justice is pursued after a genocide, the aftermath of genocide? Why is this important to a student here at Jacksonville State University?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think in our globalized world, what we have found out is that when mass atrocities take place in one part of the globe, they often have knock-on consequences. Certainly when it's close by, you see refugee flows and you can see real live people. I mean, think Haiti, think Honduras, think Venezuela showing up on our shores. And so we have an interest in, a lot of people say, how do you stem the refugee crisis? Well, you try to help the countries with their own problems so that people aren't desperate to leave because so one answer is we are an interconnected, globalized world. And that is true. It's certainly true when the conflict is close by. It's even true when the conflict is farther away. When you see about how American cell phones require this, and that from these various places across the globe. So from a purely self-interested standpoint, we ought to care because how much gas is going to cost, whether we're going to get our products, whether there are going to be refugees floating up on our shores, all of that has to do with the stability of the rest of the world. That's purely self-interested. I would say, in addition, this is a country that is far more founded on religion and beliefs in morality than a lot of countries are across the globe. And so I would like to think that most Americans would recognize that people born somewhere else are exactly like us, but for the happenstance that they were born somewhere else. There is not, in God's eyes, there is no difference. And so that we would care about other people simply as a moral imperative to do so.
I think with Nancy's earlier point about, one victim leads to one set of responses, and millions or hundreds of thousands of victims lead to other set of responses. And I guess that's when I keep hoping that in my ideological visions of the nation, that we will somehow come to call out our own hypocrisy. And that has long been a quest of mine. I mean, from Jimmy Carter putting members of the Khmer Rouge into power and honestly the UN representation for Cambodia, at the same time that we're taking in Cambodian refugees because of what happened, to the very present day, throughout all the 1960s and the Cold War. And the reason Guatemalan and El Salvadorian refugees want to come to the United States is because of the United States' deep involvement in the genocides that happened there. And were we the ones pulling the triggers? No, but were we the ones training the troops? And were we the ones giving them guidance? And were we the ones giving them intelligence and all these other things? Yes. So if it's important to you to have a nation of values and morals and principles and faith-based background, then we do have an obligation to call out our own hypocrisies, to call out our own failings, and to make them right. And so, when do we do that? Well, ideally before people start dying. But if not, then in the wake of that, then we have to be responsible for some of the outcomes.
Do you think that relates them back to an idea of American exceptionalism? Are we exceptional that way? Will we have to hold ourselves to a standard different than others? Or is that something that's more of an international standard that we hope everyone will share?
Well, if we were exceptional, we would hold it and we would act on things. We're not exceptional in thinking that we somehow are better than that, or that we will listen to the larger narratives that we're told, and somehow that makes it all better. I'm also working on a monograph now comparing Holocaust museums throughout the world, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. and the opening scene to the elevator, right? You have to tell Americans why you should care about the Holocaust. But what they aren't telling you is that until we got to that point in which our soldiers and leaders and generals are able to stand in the camps and say, we're liberating all of these people from this horrendous action, we had years of knowing about it and actively chose not to do something. And look, I appreciate when people are asked to call themselves to task for making decisions about how do you organize your resources in a life and death moment. And the war was a very big life and death moment. And so it was a calculation. All along, it was a calculation, and that's a heck of a calculation to have to make. But we did make that calculation. So it sometimes bothers me that we're like, oh, we're the hero liberators. And at the same time, it's like, well, many of these people wouldn't have needed to be liberated if we had made different decisions. I don't know how it would have gone had we made different decisions. But if that was our number one goal, then we didn't do it right.
I was going to go in a completely different direction on the American exceptionalism, because I do think it provides a plausible justification for the United States' deep antipathy for the International Criminal Court. I could spend a lot of time taking down a lot of arguments that are bandied about sort of in the popular press against the International Criminal Court, because most of them are really not even worth discussing. They're so not based in fact. But one that I think is the fact the United States, at least historically, has had a greater role in peacekeeping than any other nation on the globe. So the United States has sent more people and more money and has just played a leading role in global conflict zones in trying to keep the peace. Have we always done it perfectly well? No, absolutely not. And I don't dispute anything that Dr. Bauer said about other involvements that were not so benign or advantageous. But the United States has a point when it says, well, gosh, if you want us to continue to involve our people and our money in this way, then you can't expect us to have the same response to criminal accountability as other countries that don't become involved. It's easy for, Sweden not to worry too much about this because they send this many people and that many kroners, right? Not so much. But if we're going to send a lot and you want us to continue to do so, you can't expect us to be happy about these developments. And I do think Are there good arguments against that? Yeah, but I do think it's a point, and it needs to be taken into account.
It's a really good point, though, too. There's a lot of talk about these ideas in the media, but you guys are experts on this. So you have an audience here, people who mostly learn about these topics of mass atrocities and genocide and war crimes from the media. What's maybe a thing or two that you could share with us that you think the media or we, the public at large, misunderstand about these topics?
I'll start. That's a great question. I think, and if you read responsible news sources and read to the end and not just read the headlines, then generally speaking, you get a pretty accurate viewpoint. But I do think, I said this earlier today, politicians in particular are very keen to criticize international bodies because it's an easy target. It's a bunch of foreigners all over there who are trying to tell us what to do. And it's an outrage. And so it is just very easy for politicians to I wouldn't even say exaggerate, because it's more than exaggerate, lie about the risks that these institutions pose to the United States. I will give two examples. The first one, there are a bunch of human rights treaties. And so what are human rights treaties? They are treaties where countries get together and say, we all promise not to torture anybody, or we all promise to try to end discrimination against women, right? Well, the United States is legendarily not inclined to ratify these treaties. And there's one treaty on the rights of children that literally every country on the face of the globe has ratified except the United States. We are the one country. The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, we have about 3 or 4 compatriots in the globe, but not many. And when you look at the propaganda against these things, it is just kind of ridiculous. Well, we can't ratify the Convention on the Protection of Children because then you'd be having UN bureaucrats telling parents what to do with their own children, and that's an outrage, and we won't allow it. Now, somehow, the other 192 nations on the globe don't see that this way. And I guess they just don't care about parents. I don't think so. I think that it's not actually accurate. But I do think it is it's just such an easy straw man to be pointing the fingers at the UN. And I'm not going to tell you the UN is perfect. But the kinds of things that you hear politicians say about these bodies either reflect utter ignorance or they're just using it because it's a fantastic soundbite.
I don't want anybody to think actually that all the media surrounding atrocities and genocide is bad. In fact, I think some of the best histories we've gotten from the front. I can think of Christopher Miller's work right now on Ukraine. I mean, he's writing for the New York Times. He's writing for a bunch of other places. I go back to Bosnia, Joe Sacco, not only a journalist, but also a comic artist, right? And so has given us, I think, some of the greatest accounts of what was really going on in Bosnia. And then Samantha Power, she started as a journalist, and that's how she made her way into international affairs and the legal standings and all those other things. So long-form journalism still gives us a great deal of value when covering these stories, because these are long-term stories. From Roger Smith told me in 1987, genocides don't end; they continue to play down through the ages, and that's true. And as we move further into the worlds of these studies on obedience and epigenetics and The fact that, we seem to be recycling genocides. As one of my students said the other day, like what's going on in Darfur and what's going on in Sudan, that seems recycled. What's happening in Haiti, that's recycled. And yeah, so we are. So I think, media can play a great role. I think what does happen, of course, is people want to pick sides. It's a quick soundbite. It gets me through 2 minutes on the television news, or I'm not really having the time to parse out everything that's happening. And so snap judgments are made, and snap then assessments lead to actions, behaviors, policies, or decisions to ignore, as it may be. A couple of years back, Nancy and I both participated in the ICC Scholars Forum, and one of the judges took me aside afterwards and said, keep up your work, because I was presenting something I was doing on assessing the social media feed of the International Criminal Court. And that's an atrocious place. I mean, if you ever want to find what you think is the worst of humanity participating in social media, go onto the Facebook page of the ICC. And it's overwrought, it's ridiculous, it's accusatory, it's inflammatory, it's insulting to everybody that you can imagine. And it just also reveals the extent to which people don't know what the ICC does. Or know how it should be and what it's supposed to be and its terms. And so I think if we turn to US media, I'm turning into social media. And if we start talking about social media, then that's a whole other realm of problems when it comes to understanding genocide, atrocities, the prospects for justice, the needs for justice, and what we really should be thinking and doing about these things. Because it's a wild world out there.
I want to get just one more topic for us to talk about before we invite the audience to ask a few questions here. We started this conversation by talking about sort of the importance of World War II and the international regime that was created out of that. Nancy talked a lot about the importance of those institutions of the ICJ and the ICC that have been developed. JD, you brought up some of the questions of these institutions and their ability to produce meaningful value to victims. Do you think the contemporary environment still supports your position, or do you think the contemporary environment is challenging your position on these institutions and where we should be going forward with regards to genocide and mass atrocities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd like to see most progressions as 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It is rare that we are on in any realm, right? Whether it's education, poverty, crime control, domestic crime control, it's rarely a straight upward trajectory, right? And so we are in right now, there's, at least in the United States, but the United States is such an important global actor. We're in a phase of regression. There's just no question that we are taking some steps back. And that does not only address, this is so much beyond international criminal justice. It is about the notion that after World War II, the notion was that right-minded countries should band together. We should try to form consensus, think NATO, think the EU. We will be better if we emphasize our similarities and work together, even though we do have differences, toward a better future, more stability, more economic development, etc. This is how, you get trade agreements and the WTO. It goes across a whole realm of arenas. Nationalism has been on the rise for, at least the last while, and I think it is continuing to be on the rise right now. And so as far as international criminal justice, it's feeling the effects of nationalism, but it isn't just that. There really is a sense of, I would call it, and I'm not a historian, I'm not an international relations scholar, I am a mere lawyer, but it very much feels like we are stepping back into a pre-World War II time of might makes right, and so no, it definitely doesn't support my position, but I also am optimistic enough to and know enough about history to see that there are dialecticals. We do, come around at a time, and so this is the time, to my mind, to dig your heels in and say, okay, things are not going very well for the causes that I believe in at this moment, but it's not the time to retreat. It's the time to be steadfast and hope for a better future.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I don't think it supports my argument. One of the things I do think is a positive step has been the increasing move to have more judicial institutions, more country-based, and so more cultural-based, more based in the legal system, more based in the grounded facts. And so I've appreciated some of the hybridity of the courts. If I disagree with the international courts as a unilateral body and a body above all others, that doesn't mean that I don't disagree, that I disagree with the national courts, and that the international community somehow has an obligation to help fund them and support them and protect them and do all those other things. And so, maybe it's the permanency of the international court that might bother me in some ways, because then, as you hinted, it's a body looking for a purpose. And if it's not going to evidently see that purpose immediately, then it's going to have to search harder for that purpose. I don't think that really, I don't want to malign the people who work there. Some of them are my good friends, and some of them are all of them are wonderful people taking on a wonderful objective. But I think that there are always going to be these institutional things. Second fact is that I view the International Criminal Court as akin to New Jersey, and that is nobody hates New Jersey like New Jerseyans, right? We hate ourselves the worst, and so we'll tell you all of our own problems and how we should fix them. We have an opinion on that. I think the ICC staff all have that too. I see them actively working to be their own worst critics in order to address what they see as their own shortcomings. They're not blind to this stuff. They've participated in these debates and discussions. So they're pushing in that direction. To me, that's a positive sign of the institution. Do I see the world conditions right for this? No, I would agree with Nancy. I think we've taken more than one step back. I think we've taken 6, 7, 8 steps back, maybe, in my assessment. And I read a lot of science fiction, right? And you read science fiction or write science fiction because you want the world that you create or read about to be the world you want to have, not the world that is. And so if I were writing that science fiction of tomorrow, I would write a very different story for the framework and the protection and the performance of international criminal justice.
Well, thank you, guys. I now to our house audience here, to our students and our other members of the community that joined us. If you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll come on over with the microphone and let you ask them.
Howdy, y'all. Thank y'all for coming out. My name is Nicholas Clark, and I'm a junior here, getting a degree in business. I'm a pretty active person in the political scene, and y'all are experts in your field. So I wanted to ask you a simple question. Do y'all have an opinion on what right-wing or other political movements and political people on social media in America are the most appealing to specifically men and women in this generation that are most likely to engage in domestic terrorism?
That's almost sort of well beyond my ken. Honestly, I would have to say I'm sort of just stumped by the question, because I'm not sure where that would play into the pursuit of international justice. Can you point that? Can you repaint the question for me?
Terrorist movements which could lead to a rise in that specific terroristic ideology gaining a foothold, and maybe, especially for the domestic scene, taking power and committing either a genocide or ethnic cleansing based upon those ideologies.
I'll stay well within my boundaries here. From my entirely personal take on the state of the United States today, no, the wheels have not come off. I still have firm belief in what we possess as a nation and a national ideal and a national structure that I don't think we're, so would a group be able to take control in a way so that they would commit mass atrocities that would warrant this kind of consideration? In order for that to happen, that would entail our military falling, our government falling, and our court system becoming inoperative. And I don't, that's into my realm of science fiction, but dystopian science fiction. And I don't think that we're there yet.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Smith. Thank y'all for coming out. One, you mentioned earlier that atrocities tend to recycle. What's something that you think the international community at large can do to help these atrocities stop being recycled? And is it only the people within these countries who are recycling that material, or other people taking note?
Yeah, that's a great question. The hope for international, and mind you, I got into this field in the 90s when everybody was super optimistic. The Cold War had ended. We were all kumbaya with the Russians. And that is not the world that we have today. But what you would read about then was what is going to stop recycling or the cycle of vengeance is criminal justice, because the victims would be able to say, we don't have to take justice into our own hands. There is a body out there. And two things. One, we don't have to do it because there's a body that is actually imposing accountability. And secondly, we don't have to blame an entire group because it's not all the Serbs. It is this one, this one, this one, and this one. And we can identify people who are actually responsible and in that way absolve the rest of them. Now, the problem is, and this is a problem that we really have barely touched on, although JD mentioned the cost of international criminal justice, the costs are so high that you can never prosecute all, most, or even a substantial number of offenders. So you're always having to pick a select few out. And then the question is that enough? Is that going to be enough to tell the truth that needs to be told, vindicate the victims in the way you're hoping, and to break the cycle of violence? It's hard to know because we haven't done it very well. I mean, I agree with JD that Bosnia is not in a great place right now at all. But you know what? It hasn't started. There's no war there, and it's very hard to prove the causation in these sorts of things. I'll also point out that post-war Germany, I can't tell you how offended, insulted, and opposed the Germans were to the Nuremberg trial and the subsequent Control Council 10 trials. They were as nationalistic as anybody on the planet and thought it was an outrage. It took a full generation or more for the Germans. Now, you don't find a country that is more positive about international criminal justice than Germany is. So sometimes you got to wait a while to find out what the results are going to be.
Yeah, on November 7th, we'll find out what Hollywood thinks of Nuremberg, right? With Rami Malek and Russell Crowe coming out in the new Nuremberg film. So I don't know what we'll get out of that other than a Hollywood version. So it should be interesting to see. I think, there are 2 points I would make. One, there are a bunch of groups active now, and I participate in one we meet monthly that's really about prevention. And so prediction and prevention. And so there are several agencies out there, entities, I won't say agencies. Agencies implies government funding, mostly private funded entities where we work a lot on projecting and ranking places for how likely they are to fall into violence, and what the steps are and what the sequence would be, right? So I often tell students that, Bosnia, from everything I've seen and talk to people and keep in touch with folks there on the ground, Bosnia is 2 weeks away from another outbreak of mass atrocities. I don't mean the next 2 weeks, but if you look at the prediction statistics, and we can tell you, it would only take as short as 2 weeks for Bosnia to break out, should the right conditions materialize. And so, as we look at those predictive capabilities, I think people need a lot of education in the wake of atrocities. Rwanda in so many ways seems like on paper you'd want it to be perfect. Paul Kagame was president in the wake of this. He outlawed the use of Hutu and Tutsi. They actually banned the teaching of history that helped perpetuate the differences between the peoples for a decade. And so, did Rwandans come out of that healthy? Yeah, they did for a little bit, but then Kagame seemed to slip into another level of reality, and he and Erdogan from Turkey both became these more totalitarian leaders that have taken their countries in the wrong direction. So today, the Rwandan government is still hunting Hutus across the border in Goma. And that doesn't strike me as a people that have been healed or reformed or educated that this doesn't matter, or that you put the trials to rest. But I would look into, and I'm happy to feed you the channels of where we're talking about prevention. One is actually accessible through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's website. They'll give you a good list of where we rank and where we are in terms of violence and the likelihood that this will break out.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that? It is just an enormous disappointment and demoralization that we don't focus more on prevention, because by the time you are talking about international criminal justice, it's a massive failure. You're just trying to pick up the pieces, because whatever you do, you have hundreds of thousands of families, right? Let alone victims themselves. And from everything I've read, and I'm no economist any more than I am a historian, but prevention is so much cheaper. I mean, the costs for the United States to engage in any sort of peacekeeping or do anything when the conflict has already broken out are so much higher than prevention efforts. And yet we don't seem to. You would think that these lessons would have penetrated better than they have, but they don't.
Yeah, if U.S. insurance companies think prevention is cheaper and better, it has to be true in international justice.
Hello, I'm Maury Smith. I'm a freshman here. We spoke about social media. Can y'all go further in detail? Do you think it's bettering the younger generation's outlook on international justice, or if it's making it worse?
Oh, I don't know that I have a concrete answer to that. I'm a firm believer that social media has made all things worse, quite frankly. And not that it's not good to keep up with your family and pictures of your friends and things, but on the whole, we know that social media is something that is not benign. The people behind it are not necessarily horrific people, but they're also people with an angle. And that angle is not in your best interest. And that angle is leading to a lot of other things that we aren't even, on a day-to-day basis, don't even think about. And so I think for the most part, I don't see any evidence that there's been any social media that has contributed to the rise of like a support group for international justice or positive education about international justice. That's not to say that people aren't using Zoom to great effect if they have like-minded communities and things like that. Or maybe there's some good stuff on a Discord chat that I don't know about. But on the whole, I would have to say that it at best has had no impact. But most likely, it has had worse.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with anything that JD said at the global level. At the level of just evidence. I mean, my scholarly career has focused heavily on international criminal evidence. I alluded to the fact that you would think these crimes are easy to prove, and they are if you're talking about, the guy on the ground, but they're much harder to prove if you're trying to hold the leader responsible. But social media actually has had a beneficial impact in certainly just getting a lot. It turns out that it's not really a good idea to post pictures of yourself on Facebook holding the beheaded head of the enemy combatant who you just killed, right? And people don't seem to realize that, and then they get brought up on charges, and I tend to think that's probably a pretty good thing. And there have been whole cases, both at the ICC and certainly in different countries that are, so like there's a lot of places in Europe where say Germany, where Germans of maybe Syrian descent, Iraqi descent, went to the Middle East to fight for ISIS. And then they came back to Germany. And it's been very easy for Germany to then prosecute a lot of these people simply because they convicted themselves. They just posted all this stuff on social media, and it's a pretty straightforward trial. But even at the ICC, there has been one and only guilty plea, and it's of a guy who was with an Islamist group in Mali, and there's a video of him hacking down the Timbuktu mausoleums, and so he's convicted of a war crime of destroying cultural property. So I do think at the level of evidence, social media has been beneficial. It has also, but it does give rise to problems. For instance, a lot of, like YouTube wants to take some of this off immediately. Why? Because they're afraid they're going to get sued for stirring up violence if you're having all these videos. And then institutions like the ICC are upset because they were counting on YouTube keeping this stuff up there. So it creates a lot of technical problems. And I don't disagree with anything JD said about the global negative impact of social media. But in my little world of evidence, I am glad that a lot of these videos have been posted.
Yeah, I actually have to concede that. I was thinking in that direction. And that's a great lesson for college students. Social media is great for incriminating yourself. So there's that lesson. But yes, there are groups that are actually working with people on the ground in Ukraine and other places on how to timestamp and date stamp and prove that this was taken at such and such a time. And so in that regard, I think it's a great tool. But I think that goes further than social media. That just goes to digital evidence and things like that. But yeah, 100% corrected on that.
Hello, my name is Andrew Ruiz. I am a junior history and political science major here at JSU. My question kind of touches on things that both of you guys spoke about, but specifically for Dr. Conbs. We spoke about various definitions of justice. My question was, in the case that justice kind of relies on maybe accountability or sort of instilling the fear of living the rest of your life behind bars, how would the ICC or ICJ go about pushing justice in countries or accountability to those who don't really care about the consequences, like Dr. Bowers mentioned? They also don't rely on, the moral or faith-based legal foundation that we're based upon. And the second part would be, how does this prove substantial or justice to those seeking the accountability from the people that did the wrongdoings and the families and the victims?
Yeah, I think you have to start with the idea that you can only prosecute a small number of people. So justice is going to be partial. However you define it, it's going to be partial. And it's not a random sampling of people either, because less powerful people are much more people from less powerful countries are much more likely to get prosecuted than people from, the United States. If we go back to the question about the media, I can promise you that there is not a single American anywhere here on the globe that has anything to fear from the ICC. There will never be an American brought before the ICC. And that has to do with a number of legal impediments, but it also just has to do with political power that we have that other countries don't have, right? So I think the bottom line question is the world better off with a justice that is selective and partial? Let's throw an even more incendiary word at it. It's discriminatory. The justice is discriminatory. It's not as though it's a random sampling of 10% of the people. It is a sampling of less powerful, less globally connected people than others. Are we better off with that state of affairs for today and the hopes that justice becomes more inclusive over time? Or do we say that just doesn't sound like justice at all? I mean, you can think about it just in stark terms here. And let's say, I'm literally pretending, but in the state of Alabama, only people with brown eyes are prosecuted for murder. Anybody with blue or green eyes is not. Is that a better state of affairs because you're going to get some murderers? Or do we say that is just so hopelessly discriminatory that we'd rather no murderers get punished than to have a system where it's arbitrary and discriminatory in that way? And I think that's where we're at. I tend to think let's impose accountability on some murderers rather than none. But I understand that that's the contestable point.
Thank you. My name is Nick Schell. I'm getting a degree in political science. I'm a junior. And I think I'm probably going to ask one of the most controversial questions of today, because it seems it hasn't been brought up once during the topic. How do you hold someone accountable who has gone away from justice seemingly at every turn, especially in the international courts? If you look at, and this is obviously controversial, but if you look at the secular state of Israel and you look at what is going on in the offensive war against Gaza, how do you hold someone accountable like Prime Minister Netanyahu when he has indictments for miscegenation that he's avoiding for corruption? So how does the ICJ and the ICT hold a man like that accountable if he has his whole nation behind him?
Well, and the ICJ wouldn't, right? ICJ would have to be another nation with, well, it has been attempted, right? Somebody took Israel to the ICJ and tried to.
It's still before.
Africa.
Yeah, it's still before the court. Yeah.
Right. A partial decision was rendered
just the other day. Yeah.
Come back for some other things. So, so that's the only way, but that's not holding him responsible. That's holding Israel responsible, if that's what they wish to do, right? And then ICC is, they've issued the indictment. But it's up to the world to enforce. Israel is not a signatory, so it's not going to be enforced in Israel. And then if another nation would have to decide that this is something that we believe in a sufficient way, that we will, when the opportunity arises, perform the acts necessary to carry out the indictment. But until the world is ready, then again, that's the nature of international law, which can be abrogated, not enforced, selectively enforced. And so it's all choices that countries make. And countries don't have to agree with it. And so if they don't agree with it, we were talking earlier, he took a circuitous route to get to New York to the UN. A circuitous route intended to avoid any potential that could result in those consequences.
Yeah, and what you have to, we don't know the future, right? But there are examples, both positive and negative. If you go back, as Dr. Gross mentioned, there was a special court for Sierra Leone, and there was a guy by the name of Charles Taylor who was the president of Liberia. And he was accused of fomenting a lot of rebellion in Sierra Leone. And so the tribunal in Sierra Leone issued an indictment against him. and he was fomenting all sorts of war in his own country. And so his own country, he decided he was going to get out of the presidency. Things were looking kind of rough for him. And he was going to take a seaside resort in Nigeria and live out his life there. So he goes into exile in Nigeria. There's this indictment floating around in Sierra Leone from this tribunal, and nobody thinks anything is going to happen to him. And then there's a new president elected in Liberia, and she says, you know, Nigeria, we think you ought to arrest this guy. He's over there at the beach in your country. We think you ought to arrest him and send him to the tribunal. And there was a bit of back and forth, but he did. He got sent to the tribunal. I don't think he ever expected that. Certainly not when he was president. You can say the same thing about Slobodan Milosevic, who had been a high-level official in the former Yugoslavia, in Serbia. He got sent to the Yugoslav tribunal at a time when he probably wasn't expecting it. And just in the last few months, the former president of the Philippines, everybody thought he was going to get away with it, and he just got sent to the ICC. Now, are there counterexamples? Yes. The president of Sudan, al-Bashir, is nowhere to be found. He's I think right now he would be, if anybody's paying attention to what's going on in Sudan, he'd be happy to go to the ICC. And that's actually an interesting point. There are at least 2 or 3 defendants who came to the ICC. Why? Because they turned themselves in. Why? Because it turns out it's really dangerous to be either a tin pot dictator or a rebel leader. And so they're thinking that a prison cell in The Hague is looking pretty good. And they actually literally turned themselves in. One of them went to the US Embassy and said, hello, could you send us to The Hague, please? So you don't know. I mean, would I think that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be arrested tomorrow? No, I'd bet a lot of money that he isn't. Might he be? Or I don't think it's that much of a long shot. Let's just say that ICC indictment might prove very handy to a new Israeli government that wants to turn the page on this chapter, doesn't want to have and this is what happened in the Philippines. They could have prosecuted Duterte themselves, but that would have given a lot of political disruption. Let's just send them off to The Hague and let those internationals do it. And then we get what we would like without dirtying our hands. So it's a crapshoot, but there are certainly examples in recent history where leaders who you thought were not going to ever face accountability did, in fact.
I want to take just a question here from our online audience for you guys. We've had well over 30 plus people and lots of comments. And Sarah asked a question here. What are the means of handling genocide that results maybe from environmental destruction or from resource destruction? How does that work into the equation of this topic of genocide in a larger concept?
There's a movement. It's been spearheaded by a number of environmental scholars and genocide experts to have a new crime as a crime against humanity called ecocide. And the idea would be, because currently you can impose accountability for harms to the environment, but only insofar as they fit within other established crimes against humanity that typically involve harms to people. And particularly if it's not in the context of an armed conflict, so that you can't use a war crime designation. So ecocide, a lot of scholars have thought that, and the definition that they came up with, it was launched, I want to say about 2 years ago to great fanfare. A number of very well-regarded international lawyers participated in this effort. And the standards are very high. I cannot off the top of my head recite what the definition is, but it required large-scale environmental destruction of the sort, I think, examples might be destruction of the rainforests, where you're really impacting both people and the natural, large scale animals and people. But that's certainly one way. Without that, and that has not, it hasn't really gotten legs at the moment. Again, we are in a phase of retrenchment. So adding new crimes to the lexicon seems a bit ambitious. Another new crime, this is not on the topic, but gender apartheid has been advanced, particularly to describe what's going on in Afghanistan now with the Taliban. But that's another new one. Without that, you do need to fit it in, at least legally. I'm not talking about the historical or political science notions. I'm talking about the legal concepts. You need to fit it in to one of the other categories. And so then your environmental destruction is going to have an impact on people, because it's going to have to be extermination or murder or torture or some other form. It's just a different way of harming people. It's harming them through the environmental consequences.
Yeah, I think we see people still are trying to gear up for some of that as the rainforest is cleared and tribal peoples, indigenous peoples are eradicated. Some of those companies are known for mass slaughter of the people. But there have also been a series of cases before ICJ where countries have said, you're blocking our water, which I think is really going to be, water is one of the next great contested fields for violence. And as water depletes, as water is siphoned off, as water becomes owned, these are areas that we're going to have to start to look into about the integration of resources in resource distribution as a method of conducting these kinds of crimes, so I think countries have a way of trying to get at that right now. I think it's already happening. States in the United States are starting to sue each other over water and over water rights and how much they're allocated and how much they can take and exclusions and all of that. So I think the legal channels are going to be there for trying to do it about the resource itself, but where it turns into then killing as part of that, then that it gets into the ICC or the ICC and other areas.
Well, an hour and a half goes by really quick. I want to thank you both for coming here today. I want to thank you guys for sharing with us. Thank you guys for coming and participating today. If you haven't signed in, please sign in. If you are here for Jack's Mix, we'll have a QR code up here. We'll pop it online for those of you watching, so you can scan and get your QR code for a general education micro-credential. And if you wouldn't mind, if you're in-house, we have a post-assessment just to get feedback about what you thought about today. So if you wouldn't mind sticking around to fill those out, I'll have them up here, hand them around a bit too. But would you all please join me in sharing appreciation to Dr. Bauer and Dr. Combs for being